it's time to begin itinerant conversations. Let's start with the word of prayer and then we'll get into our class. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we have to come together and study your word. Just pray that you be with those that might be traveling or sick, and just pray that your will be done in those situations. Father, we thank you for your word and the guidance it provides us into our lives, and just pray that we might have attentive minds and hearts as we continue to study this great book of Esther. In your son's name we pray. Amen. All right, let's be opening to Esther chapter 6. That's where we're going to be spending our time today. Now, as we know in Esther, we're reading the story of how through Esther and Mordecai primarily, God works to save his people through some evil things that are going on. But before we get into chapter 6, just to give us a little bit of context, in chapter 5 we read about a banquet that Esther hosted for the king as well as Haman. And Haman, of course, we know is the one who's at the head of the plot to destroy the Jews. But it's at that banquet of chapter 5 that Esther requests that the king and Haman attend a second banquet that Esther was to prepare. There are several banquet scenes in the book of Esther. So in that context, in verses 9 through 14 of chapter 5, we read about how once again Haman becomes angry with Mordecai because of Mordecai's refusal to pay honor to Haman. That's really what drives a lot of the story. So, as a result of those things, chapter 5 concludes with Haman's wife and his friends advising Haman to build a gallows for the purpose of hanging Mordecai, after which he would attend the banquet that Esther was to prepare. All of that is what brings us into chapter 6. In chapter 6, there's 14 verses, but among other things, what we read in those 14 verses that make up chapter 6 is a story about how Haman's intentions for hanging Mordecai would be foiled as a result of the king's desire to bring honor to Mordecai, or to bring to Mordecai the honor that Mordecai refused to pay to Haman. So, since that's the case, since there is that idea of the king desiring to bring honor to Mordecai, that's the principle we're going to look at in chapter 6 as this concept of finding honor. In other words, what we find in this chapter are some principles about how honor is found, and those are the principles we're going to look at as we take a journey through chapter 6 and the 14 verses that make it up. Now, the first principle we'll examine based on verses 1 through 3 is that honor comes when we do good. The second principle we'll examine based on verses 4 through 11 is that honor comes when we are humble. And finally, the third principle we'll examine based on verses 11 through 14 is that honor comes when we have the right attitude. Now, what we'll learn is that honor is something that ultimately comes from God, and that honor is something else that comes by the providence of God. So that in mind, again, we'll just break it down in chunks. So we'll start in verses 1 through 3. If somebody wouldn't mind reading verses 1 through 3 of Esther chapter 6. Okay, thank you, Dean. So again, the principle we're going to be looking at is that honor comes when we do good. Now, what's the scene there in verse 1? We've read the text, so what's the scene? How is this section introduced, in other words? Okay, yeah, we're going to talk about that, but yeah, verse 1 tells us that the king could not sleep. And so what does he do in response to that? He wants to read about the good things. So yes, so he gives an order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, the text says, and they were read before the king. Now what are these chronicles, these records that he's reading? Okay, the facts as they happened. Any other ideas? Right. Yeah, absolutely. So it's a timeline. Now, what book do we have in our Bible that bears the same name? First and Second Chronicles. What are those books? What are the books of First and Second Chronicles by their nature? The history of the kings, the chronicles of the kings, Dad said. Yeah, so this is the same kind of thing that he's asking for. It's obviously not the book of First and Second Chronicles that he's asking for, but it's that same timeline. It's a record of things that happened during his rulership of King Ahasuerus. So he can't sleep, so he says, I want to read these. So this is what he asked for. Anything else on verse 1? Yeah. That's been said about this situation, that God might be the reason he can't sleep, and his hand that's working in all of this. And we're going to see that as we come to the next few verses. Anything else on verse 1? Okay. So in verse 2, the author records for us that among the things that were found in these chronicles was what? What does he read about there in verse 2? That's it. Yeah, and that's what Sandy was alluding to, is there'd been this plot to assassinate the king, and who intervened? Mordecai. So he reads about what Mordecai had done to foil this plot. Now, what is written here recalls what we read in Esther 2, verses 21 through 23. If we were to go back, we'd read about this plot. Mordecai saves the king from being killed by the two officials named here. So what's implied here is that this was recorded in these chronicles that he'd asked for. Some of the events that we read earlier in Esther were recorded in these chronicles. So it was all part of this timeline that had been that's recorded for us in the book of Esther. So, questions or comments on verse 2? Yeah. So what does the king do? He reads this. What does he do in verse 3? What does he ask? That's it. He asks, well, has anything been done for this Mordecai person that I'm reading about here? And what's the response? They say, no, nothing's been done. So the author is recording for us in response to what he read about Mordecai. He simply asks, have we honored this individual? And the servants say, no, nothing's been done for him. We don't know. We can't say why that wasn't asked. Yeah. Mordecai wasn't an attention-seeking person. Now, yes, he did some things that drew attention to himself, but he wasn't that kind of person, oh, look how great I am. And we're going to talk about that when we get into verse 4 and following. But he'd done something good at this point. and it was recorded in these chronicles. And so this is where we're beginning to see that honor comes when we do good. Now, that doesn't mean we should be out seeking that honor. It's just the complete opposite. But Mordecai had done something good, and that was going to bring him honor. Now, what these verses also show us is that Mordecai had not asked for that recognition for what he had done, but the king found out about it and wanted to do something for him. Anything else on verses 1 through 3? Okay. That's going to bring us into the second point that we read about in verses 4 through 11. If somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses. Thank you, Lane. It's a lot of information here. So, what happens in verse 4? Yeah, yes. He realizes there's somebody in the court, in the king's court, just outside the palace, and we find out it's Haman. Now, what's Haman's intention in coming to the king? Cool. The very opposite of what the king is. He's coming to say, hey, we need to hang Mordecai. So that sets the stage for us for a conversation that's going to take place between the king and Haman as to how the king should honor Mordecai. Mordecai has no idea of what the king's intentions are. Now, context indicates, as we'll see, that Haman is not yet aware that the king planned to honor Mordecai. And so it's going to be Haman that believes who the king is going to honor Haman. So when we go on into verse 5, we read simply that the king's servants inform the king that it's Haman who is in his court, at which point the king allows Haman to come in. Just a way of saying that the king is permitting Haman to come into his presence. But the reason the king wishes to see Haman is not the same reason that Haman wishes to see the king. Questions or comments on verses 4 or 5 before we get into verse 6? Yeah, there's a great sense of irony here for sure. Yeah, it appears that way because this is all seems to be all taking place during the nighttime hours. So that's true. Yeah. Right. That is true. So that's important to remember. Anything else on verses 4 or 5? Okay. So what happens in verse 6? Haman comes in and what happens? The king asks him a question. What's the question there? What shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? So king tells Haman, hey, I want to honor somebody. What should I do for this person? So Right. Yeah. Yeah, it does. His bubble gets burst. So, so it's here in verse 6 that we're seeing they're on two different pages. And Haman's beginning to believe, well, it's me. So, what we're also seeing here is that Haman, he's sidetracked from his original intention. We have to remember he's here to see the king, to see about hanging Mordecai. But now he believes the attention is coming on himself. Say, well, let me set that aside because I'm about to be honored, is what Haman believes. So, still believing that, in verses 7 through 9, what's the picture Haman begins to paint here? How does he answer the question? It is a grand plan for sure. So, what does he want done according to these verses? Haman thinks this is for himself, so what does he ask for? All, absolutely. It's a parade. Yeah. So so when we read these verses, what we find is that the way in which Haman wants this person to be honored, it's in very royal fashion. He wants to be presented as royalty. So we see that beginning in verse 8. He wants a royal robe placed upon him, and to ride a horse would be wearing a royal crown. At least that's the way the New American Standard um, presents it. And then verse 9, we see the description of the way that he wants to be dressed, led on horseback through the city by one of the king's most noble princes. And so, yes, the picture being drawn in these verses is that since Haman believes it's himself that's going to be honored, he wishes to be presented as royalty before all the people. But again, his context will indicate what he didn't know is that it would be Mordecai who would be honored in this way. Yeah, that's true. Absolutely. He wants to be presented on the same level as a king, we might say. And the godliness with contentment is great gain. I believe that's in one of the Timothy letters. Um, no, he's not. Yeah, absolutely. He's not content with where he's at, and he wants to be the center of attention, as unlike Mordecai. So, anything else in verses 7 through 9? Okay. So that brings us into verse 10. What happens in verse 10? The bubble burst. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. So he's humiliated, really. He's humbled, we might say. So so the king commands Haman to do for Mordecai what Haman thought was going to be done for himself. So he's being humiliated, humbled again. So anything on verse 10, any other observations? For absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. So yeah, it's a really insulting thing to Haman that he's not getting honor. Number one, as Desiree pointed out, the person he hates the most is going to be receiving this honor. And we have to remember that part of the context is Haman was coming to see about getting Mordecai hanged. But now he's sidetracked, and now the person he wants hanged is going to receive this very royal kind of honor. So, summarizing all that, verse 11 is when this happens. Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, "Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires or delights to honor." So this is summarizing the fact of Haman's humiliation. It's a complete reversal of circumstances. Yeah, and that's definitely one. Yeah, exactly. It complicated his plan. Now, so with that in mind, what we should also understand from these things that was among other things that it was more or Haman's pride and arrogance that led to his humiliation. Haman arrogantly believed that it was he who deserved to be honored. But the king says, no, it's Mordecai that deserves to be honored. Why? Because of what Mordecai had done for him back in chapter 2. But Mordecai, again, he wasn't seeking for that recognition. He saw something had to be done. He did it, left it at that. But Haman did seek recognition for things that he had wanted to do for the king. So, yeah, it's a good reminder of that. That's right. Do things not to be seen by men. Um, so, this is why we can say that the principle of verses 4 through 11 is that with the idea of finding honor, is that honor comes when we are humble. Now, when we read the scriptures, one thing we find is that it is humble people who are honored the most. Now, based on these verses, a humble person is a person who does not seek that recognition for the things they have done. It's someone who does things not because they seek to be honored, but because those things are the right thing to do in any given circumstances. So if we're humble in this way, these verses reveal that this can lead to honor. Jesus himself says that the humble shall be exalted, which is another way of saying that it's humble people who will be honored the most. Any other questions or comments on these verses before we conclude the chapter? Okay. So this brings us into verses 12 through 14, if somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses. And verse 14. Okay. Thank you, Sandy. So again, the point we're going to be looking at here is that honor comes when we have the right attitude. So Mordecai's been honored. How does Haman respond to all this? He's ashamed. Is that the word you have there in verse 11? Left in shame and grief. Okay. So that's his response to all of this. It says, mourning with his head covered is the way New American Standard reads. So after the events of verses 4 through 11, Mordecai, he rushes home. He doesn't want to be seen because of how humiliated he has just been. So the author of Esther is continuing to paint the picture about that and what he had to do in bringing honor to Mordecai. So he returns to his home in a state of grief, of shame, because what his intentions again have been foiled. He's completely humiliated. Anything else on verse 12? Right. 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 Yeah. It's talks more about his character. Is he's still thinking it should have been me that was honored, and so that's why he has this mourning grief kind of attitude, because he's still thinking it should have been me. So. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And good. Yeah, that would be an application. It was his plan, not God's plan. But yeah, it was his friends and his wife that encouraged him to do this. So yes, he's coming back to these same people and saying, in humiliation, it didn't work. And so that's what brings us into verse 13. He goes back and tells his wife and his friends what had happened. What do they say to him? Yeah, they say, yeah, that's true. They say, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. What are they saying? I mean, yes, it's that you're in trouble attitude, but what do they emphasize here about Mordecai? He's Jewish. It's ultimately about God. Right. They don't say God. They don't recognize God for who he is. That's it. They know somebody is taking care of the Jews. And you see this all throughout the Old Testament. People hear about the Jews, about what God is doing with them. So now they're issuing a warning to Haman about what's eventually going to happen to him. If Mordecai was in fact of Jewish origin, Haman would not overcome him, will not defeat him, but will surely fall before him. Now that has the sense that if this Mordecai, who has begun to bring Haman to ruin, humiliate Haman, was a Jew, Haman would not be able to defeat Mordecai. Haman's whole purpose in life at this point is to defeat Mordecai. But now his wife and his friends are saying, if this man's a Jew, you're not going to succeed. And one reason we know this is because this word fall, it has the idea of bringing something to ruin, and Mordecai would eventually bring Haman to ruin, but it would be God through Mordecai, as we know. So this expresses, as was pointed out, an awareness about how God takes care of these Jews. Now, they're not necessarily recognizing that, but as Desiree pointed out, they are recognizing somebody's taking care of these Jewish people. In the grand scheme of things, the Jews are a very small group of people, but somebody is taking care of them. And again, as I've said, when you read the Old Testament, non-Jewish people see how the Jews are taken care of. The Egyptians saw it. Other people in Joshua and Judges saw it. And this is the realization that Haman's wife and his friends are coming to. Haman, you will not defeat this person if this Mordecai is a Jew. Now, since that's true, one commentator says that what Haman is warned about here is a prediction of the events to come that we read about in Esther. Very prophetic statement is what they're saying here. Questions or comments on verse 13? Yeah. Right. And it's more of God's providence at work here. Yeah. 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 And we're going to see what happens to Haman and not too long from now in our studies. So, anything else on verse 13? Okay. So, verse 14, the chapter concludes. While Haman was still talking with his wife and his friends, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So, during this conversation, Haman is coming to this banquet that Esther was planning. Now, in this verse, the author is beginning to transition to the events we read about in chapter 7. And we're obviously not getting into chapter 7 today. So with that in mind, this has the sense that during his conversation with his wife and friends, these eunuchs, the king's servants, they come and bring Haman to this big meal. It's the same banquet discussed in chapter 5 where Esther requested of the king to attend a banquet that she would prepare, the one we started with in the context. But again, what does this have to do with honor? What we're seeing here is that Haman had the wrong attitude. And therefore, he did not receive honor. So if we want to receive honor, we have to have the right attitude. Now, in verses 12 through 14, the picture is painted that part of the reason Haman was humiliated is because of his attitude of arrogance. In other words, much of the humiliation he experienced was a direct result of his refusal to humble himself and realize that Mordecai was deserving of the honor he would receive. So true honor, as we've already touched on, only comes through humility. Now, of course, this does not mean that seeking honor should be our motivation for being humble, but it means that humility is something that will lead to honor instead of arrogance, which ultimately leads to humiliation. And sometimes, as in Haman's case, the humiliation can be very public. So, in conclusion, when we consider everything that we've looked at, through the providence of God, honor can be found. It can be found when we do good, it can be found when we are humble, and it can be found when we have the right attitude. Now, applying these things to the concept of God's providence that we're looking at is that honor is something that ultimately comes from God. Now, among the things that the scriptures speak of, God is a God who desires to honor us. Jesus says, the humble will be exalted. This is also evidenced in the fact that God ultimately honors us by bringing us to be with him in heaven when we're faithful to him. That's honor. So when we are honored for whatever reason, we should see that that honor is something that comes by the providence of God when we are seeking to be pleasing to God. Any other questions or comments on anything in chapter 6? Mhm. Right. That's true. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Anything else? It's true. Absolutely. Anything else? All right. Matt, will you close us in prayer, sir?